Tēnā koutou. Ko tēnei te mihi atu nei ki a koutou. Ko tai mai nei ki tēnei wānanga I tēnei rangi a tāhua ki Aotearoa ki, ki te ao katoa. Nau mai haere mai ki a tātou, ko tai mai nei tēnā koutou. Tēnā koutou, tēnā rā tātou katoa. A timatanga o tēnei wānanga, haere mai koutou ki te tahi karakia. Whakatakata hau ki te uru. Whakatakata hau ki te tonga. Kia mākina kina ki uta, kia mātaratara ki tai. E hia ki ana te atakura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu, ti hei Mauriora. Tēnā koutou katoa I te rangi nei. Welcome everybody. It's very exciting to be welcoming our two guest speakers today, Dr. Saburo Omura and Lincoln Dam. It gives me great pleasure to welcome them. My name's Clive Aspin, and I'm going to be chairing this session. And in due course, we will hear from our speakers. But before we do that, we have some announcements. I just want to remind people of the community code for our session. I think the last one's particularly important. We don't take ourselves too seriously, especially today, given that it's Saturday and it's the beginning of the weekend. Kia ora tātou. Gives me great pleasure to welcome our first speaker. Saburo is a first-generation migrant from the western part of Japan. He came to this country for his tertiary education, and he settled here permanently, and he began where he completed his master's degree. He has worked for the Māori and Psychology Research Unit at Waikato University, and he's worked in several cross-cultural psychology research projects, as well as for what was then called the School of Māori and Pacific Development. He completed his doctoral research in 2014, and the title of his research was The Treaty of Waitangi and Asian Immigrants in Aotearoa, a Reflective Journey. In the ethnic community space, he was a member of the external review panel for Shakti Community Council between 2021 and 2022. Currently, he is a research associate for Te Whare Māria Tātari Kaupapa, aka the Public Policy Institute at Waipapa Taumatarau, University of Auckland, and he is a full member of the New Zealand Psychological Society. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Saburo to this talk, and I will now pass it over to you. Welcome, Saburo. Kia ora.
Tēnā rā koutou katoa. Nau mai haere mai e hui hui mai nei. Tuatahi ake, kanui te mihi kia koe Clive, mo tō tuku karakia mo te timatanga o tēnei wānanga inai anei. Ko ai aha, ki te taha o toku mama no Moti Te o Genkai, ki te taha o toku papa no Whiamaki Hiroshima, ko au te tama tuatoru a te whānau o Omura, no reira ko Saburo toku ingoa. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today. We're going to talk about Asian relationships with Te Tiriti o Waitangi, Titiro Whakamuri, Kōkiri Whakamua. Just before I start, just a little correction. So my affiliation with Auckland University hasn't quite happened just yet. That was in the motion, but that hasn't been formalized. So I kind of dropped out in the amended bio. So I do apologize for the mishap. That was purely administrative oversight on my side. So aroha mai. Here we are. I just hang on. Right. Great. So I just want to quickly start with what we're going to talk about. Ngā Rarangi Take Amato. So we're going to discuss Titiro Whakamuri, which is my part. 10 years before. I finished my PhD 10 years ago. This time of year, I was like, whew, my TOEFL is done. All right. That was huge relief, but that was, beginning of new journey, in hindsight. And the next part, second part is Lincoln's part of Kokiri Whakamoa, future going forward. And then we're going to have some concluding remarks and Q&A session. By the way, the background picture that you are seeing there is from Te Pō Wānanga Kiteao at the University of Waikato. The beautiful stained glass was the one that I used to see every day when I was going up to the office for research work and teaching assistant work, Temea. Which recently reinstalled back to the new building. And yeah, seeing them, the stained glasses, was somewhat moving to me, just, recalling my fond memory. I also want to acknowledge the Te Pō Wānanga Kiteao, because just to sort of put into the context of our research, it's quite difficult to find a institutional support. And that was just a really hard going to find, institutional support to even start this type of research. And for that reason, I shifted to Te Pō Wānanga. And I am really grateful for them supporting, whole way through. Anyway, let's just get on to my part. So, that picture was one of many pictures I took when I went to Waitangi Ground back in 2010. And this is where I met the founding members of Asians Supporting Tinoranga Tiratanga Rope. I just thought here would be a good memory to sort of put it in there, just in the context of our kōrero this morning. Right. I know that's going to be a huge mission to compress the whole, all of my PhD into one slide, but I'll give it a shot. So my research took place between 2008 and 2014, or early 2014. And of course, it started with some knowledge aspects in terms of what people out in the community knew about Te Tiriti o Waitangi and so on and so on. But soon as I started engaging with community members for key informant interviews and quite a few focus group interviews as well, all of them started talking about who they were and how they got into learning about Te Tiriti o Waitangi. And then all of them had to think about what Te Tiriti means to them. So quickly that became the whole focus of this research became about our identity and reflective journey in a new country. And when I say in a new country, that's of course migrants. But when you look at Te Tiriti o Waitangi, there's no clear differentiation between new migrants versus descendants of migrants, as opposed to tangata whenua. A lot of people kind of get muddled with that, but the point of the discussion was we needed to know where we came from, and it's not to sort of draw lines as such. This is not some kind of political discourse, but much more about affirming our own roots and what we are made up with in terms of our cultural and ethnic backgrounds. Also, all of them talked about some degrees of struggles in different ways in Aotearoa. which were better contextualized with the whole societal negligence of Te Tiriti Waitangi and Tikanga Maori. Yeah, because it's a bit like a spider web over your head. It's really hard to see what's over your head, but something in there and really annoying you. But it's really hard to see what's what the whole problems were. I mean, of course, the whole problems are much bigger than spider web. But just sort of being able to see the bigger picture was somewhat I wouldn't say settling, but just sort of knowing the bigger problem was kind of, got them thinking, okay, so what am I supposed to do? And that was also part of the reflective journey as well. The third point was there was no established pathway for Asian people to learn about Te Tiriti Waitangi for their own social, cultural context. Now, I do acknowledge that Te Tiriti Waitangi learning course for migrants have been there for a number of years. However, what I mean by that in this context is purely around, say, when people apply for, say, permanent residency or longer, visa, longer duration of visa and so on, or apply for, transfer of professional qualification, accreditation, TEMEA. They at that time, there was no clear social process, I suppose. All of them are quite voluntary, and that was largely optional. And migrants had to figure out their own way to learn about Te Tiriti Waitangi, especially for new migrants, but also for second generation onwards. So ones who are born here in Aotearoa, they also had to think about, so what does that mean to me and my whānau? Because everyone had to take their own journey. So it's not like, yeah, my parents has done that and I can just, move on or something. No, that was the most interesting, part of the interviews, I suppose, because it's not just if you like, getting a license, if you like, but everyone had to do their own bets. Anyway, the last one was, there were quite a lot of misunderstanding about disputes over Te Tiriti Waitangi. And at that time, most of them were coming from the mainstream media and ethnic media in Aotearoa at that time weren't contextualizing it very well, or simply translating what the mainstream media were reporting. So we were quite, I mean, even though the whole situation was quite appalling, we were reasonably clear about where the problems were coming from. And because we knew the source of the problems, further learnings and reflective exercise changed our community members' views. And that was the context at that time. Now, moving on to the sort of benefit of hindsight. So back in 2014, we didn't have heightened threats against ethnic communities in Aotearoa. Now, I'm not saying that there were no threats. I guess what I'm trying to say here is, yeah, we've entered a completely new era. That was, especially the March 15th Christchurch mosque shootings. I don't really know how to sort of explain this sort of feelings. I kind of feeling that just in describing the whole damage done was almost inappropriate to putting into words. That's just damage was just enormous. And of course, we've got a quite sort of organized, unprecedented scale of misinformation and disinformation on social media. And that's just beyond individual level of misunderstanding or ignorance. What really appalled me was seeing Donald Trump flag, flying next to Tinoranga Tiratanga flag, in some occasion. That was on the parliamentary ground. That was just unimaginable. If I sort of, put the clock back to 2014, 10 years ago. Yes, we had social media. Yes, we had some algorithm, but not to this scale. And so, yeah, everything have changed quite substantially since then. So yes, so compared to where we were in terms of where bigotry coming from, where misinformation coming from, it's no longer a simplistic story anymore. And that also makes our education effort much harder when we engage with ethnic communities. However, on a positive note, also in 2014, we didn't have Te Tiriti o Waitangi, Tikanga Maori, and Te Reo Maori being normalized this way. So I've seen huge uptake of people, ethnic community members taking up Te Reo Maori courses. And it's not just doing the language courses, but it's definitely being normalized. So there's a general kind of overall acceptance that knowing Tikanga Maori, knowing about Te Tiriti o Waitangi became quite normalized as almost like a prerequisite. I know we still got a long way to go. I'm not saying we are sort of happily ever after situation as of now. However, compared to where we were 10 years ago, that was a huge advancement. And we just didn't really have that. And that wasn't a long time ago. So it's personally, it's I'm quite heartened to see that everyone started to see that they have a role to play. And that also includes, Te Whare o Te Reo Maori Ora for Te Reo Maori revitalization. So it's not just a sort of statutory aspect, but not just a sort of, PR exercise, but everyone's actually taking a role to play. And having that kind of not just a public policy framework level work, but there were a lot of groundwork going on at grassroots level. That's something that we didn't used to see that a few years ago. So that's actually great change, and hence the reason why I want to believe for better future. And of course, yes, wider availability of Te Reo Maori tuition across the motu. One sort of unwitting benefit of COVID-19 lockdown was normalization of online tuition, and that actually became quite common now. So I didn't used to see that many of Te Reo Māori language courses being delivered online, and that reduces a lot of burden for people to participate in language courses, because back then it used to be only delivered through classes. Yeah, of course, that would be the best way. No doubt about that. But time of travel and being at certain locations, such and such, especially people who got long hour job, people who don't work or live close to delivery site, that was always an issue. But having this setup, becoming so common, was also a game changer as well. That definitely removed a lot of barriers. We still got a long way to go, of course. I just keep saying this, but I just want to remind people that we actually getting better. That's also, primarily because a lot of people making effort. We just shouldn't forget that. And the last point is, ethnic diversity is getting more visible than ever. My goodness. I mean, ethnic diversity is somewhat incoherent, if you like. It's not happening at the same level across the country. Some part of the country is experiencing more sort of increase, if you like, of ethnic diversity than some other parts. But by and large, yeah, Asian community is increasing its presence. So that also means that we've got a lot of duty, I suppose, moral duty. It's not just us being here, but we need to think about what we could do in return. Basically, what we've got to offer, what role we could play, for the future of Aotearoa. And us learning about Te Tiriti o Waitangi is essential part of our journey going forward. And that was my research conclusion of my research 10 years ago. Of course, it's easier said, and hence the reason we've got Lincoln to talk about more into details. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen and hand Tanaka over to Clive and then to Lincoln.
Kia ora, Saburo. That was tremendous. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to hear your observations about Te Tiriti o Waitangi and the changes that you've seen in the time you've been working in this space. So thank you very much for your contribution this morning. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Lincoln Dan. Lincoln was born in Aotearoa. His mother is Thai Chinese and his father is Chinese Cambodian and a refugee. Lincoln is a professional teaching fellow and the director of the English medium education in Te Punawananga at Waipapa Taumata Rau. His current research explores the ethics and politics of immigrant, Indigenous relations in Aotearoa, but more specifically, he is interested in the relationship between Asians in Aotearoa and tangata whenua and Te Tiriti o Waitangi. I'm especially interested and keen to hear what Lincoln has to say because I had the great pleasure of spending 3 years living in Kampuchea, also known as Cambodia, the land to which Lincoln has significant whakapapa. So welcome, Lincoln. I look forward to hearing from you, and thank you so much for giving us some of your time and insights this morning. Kia ora mai tātou.
Kia ora, Clive. Tēnā tātou katoa. Ko tēnei te mihi kia koutou, ko tai mai nei e tēnei ata. No kamapotia, no tairana, no haina hoki o ka tūpuna, I whānau mai au, I Aotearoa. He paiwai whakaako ngā io, aho I te puna wānanga, ko Lincoln Town, tōku ingoa. Thanks everyone for joining this morning's session on Asian relationships with Te Tiriti. My heartfelt thanks also to Heather Kane for the invitation to speak this morning. A mihi to you, Clive, for being our chair, and Saburo, my friend and fellow panelist this morning. I thank you for the seminal work that you did in your PhD, which led the path for my own study. And finally, thanks to you, Erica, and others like you who are working hard behind the scenes to ensure that the technology is working and that our being together here is as seamless as possible. As Clive has mentioned, my name's Lincoln. My ancestors come from Cambodia, Thailand, and China. In fact, next week, my father will have arrived in Aotearoa exactly 40 years ago as a refugee from Cambodia and as a survivor of the killing fields of the Cambodian genocide. I was born here in Aotearoa. I'm a teaching fellow, as Clive mentioned, in Te Puna Wānanga, the School of Māori and Indigenous Education at the Faculty of Education and Social Work at Waipapa Taumatoro at the University of Auckland. And I've been based in Te Puna since 2012. I've just completed my PhD on Asian relationships with Te Tiriti, and I'm just waiting now for next Thursday to come around. That will be the day that I submit, and that will be exactly 40 years since Dad arrived in Aotearoa. And it's that PhD work that I'm going to be sharing a little bit about today. It's, of course, a privilege to follow on from the amazing speakers that we've heard from throughout the week and to continue the conversation that Etienne, in particular, beautifully opened for us yesterday morning about what it means to be tangata tiriti. And for me, philosophy, or more specifically Asian philosophy, is my analytical point of entry into conversations about Asian relationships with Te Tiriti. And I'll try and do my best not to give you a headache at 10:30 in the morning this morning. In the podcast, The Philosopher's Zone, Graham Priest, a distinguished professor of philosophy, recalls that when I was young, many years ago, if you talked to professional philosophers about Asian philosophy, they'll tell you that's not philosophy, that's religion, that's mysticism, that's not real philosophy. I share this quote with you because Priest's observations mirror my own experiences of studying philosophy at university here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. In my studies, I never saw the thinking and practices of my own ancestors in the philosophy courses that I took. We read Socrates, we read Plato, we read Aristotle, we read the French philosopher René Descartes, we read Michel Foucault and others. Important though their contributions may be, I never saw people like Confucius, Lao Tzu, Siddhartha Gautama, or more popularly known as the Buddha. In my own experiences of studying philosophy, Asian wisdom was apparently not real philosophy. Instead, Asian thinking and practice, I observed, was relegated to disciplines such as theology or religious studies. Asian thinking and practice was thought of as mysticism or spirituality, or the kind of wisdom that you find in self-help books and guides. Overall, in my experiences, the discipline of philosophy was very heavily racialized. Asian thinking and practice was seen as less than and inferior to Western thought, a view that Priest goes on to argue that can only be held out of ignorance. And so over the last decade, my work has in part been about centering and amplifying Asian philosophies to speak back to and against these misplaced racialized presumptions. And I'm especially interested in what Asian philosophies have to offer to the Tiriti relationship, which is the primary focus of my kōrero this morning. So when I was growing up, I often heard from some in our communities that Te Tiriti doesn't concern us as Asian communities in Aotearoa. And I still hear this from time to time today. Te Tiriti was signed ages ago, and we just got here, or so the argument goes. With such an argument, Te Tiriti is simply relegated to the distant past, compartmentalized and divorced from the present and the future. That is, this understanding of Te Tiriti as being signed ages ago, and the fact that we just got here, supports this view of understanding the past as over there in the midst of time, while we're here in the present and the future is somewhere over there. And I think that argument that Te Tiriti was signed ages ago and we just got here is untenable. And it's untenable especially through some Asian conceptions of temporality or Asian conceptions of time. I think Asian philosophies remind us that the past is not simply in the past. The past is not simply just over there in the midst of time. Asian philosophies remind me that the past is always before us in both senses or in both meanings of that word before. That is, on the one hand, the past necessarily precedes this moment in time. Yes, 5 minutes ago or even 2 seconds ago was in the past. It's necessarily been and gone. But the past is also before us in another sense of the word before, and that is the past is always already in front of us, shaping present realities and future imaginings. We can't just continue to see the past as over there, the present as over here, and the future as over there, as if they're all divorced from one another. And let me put this into somewhat less abstract terms. Think, for example, about notions of karma. Karma, for many, for Buddhist philosophy in particular, at its simplest, is this idea about how past actions inform the present and how present actions inform the future. Think about the idea and practice of Qingming, for example, also known as Tomb Sweeping Day, which is coming up next month, a holiday and a festival to remember and honor the deceased, especially those of our blood relations. Think also about, broadly speaking, Asian notions of filial piety, that duty to care for your elders, through whose sacrifices make our present and future possible. If we really believed that the past is simply in the past, then why do we even bother to talk about notions of karma? Why even bother remembering and honoring the deceased if they've been and gone? Why bother caring for our elders and the sacrifices that they have made for our present and future if all things were simply just in the past? The point that I'm trying to make here is that Asian philosophies remind us that the past shapes present realities and future imaginings. We can't, from Asian worldviews, or broadly speaking, Asian worldviews, continue to see the past as simply in the past. And here we are in the present, and the future is still over there somewhere. But we have to start to see these notions of temporality, the past, present, and future, as inherently entangled, intertwined, mutually constituted. And so for me, Asian philosophies remind me then that Te Tiriti concerns us. It concerns us as Asian communities here in Aotearoa. It's not just this relic that we can relegate to the past. Yes, Te Tiriti emerged and was signed in the past, but I argue it shapes the present. It allows us, Asians in Aotearoa, to be here at this moment in time and potentially into the future. As the preamble to Te Tiriti makes explicit, a treaty was necessary in part because many of her, that is the Queen's subjects, were already here, were already living on this land, and with others yet to come. And I argue that as Asian communities in Aotearoa, we are those others yet to come. As noted in Mā Teke Mai, Te Tiriti is our immigration visa. The ideas and practices that I've referred to thus far, I think, speak to a broader ontological and epistemological assumption in many Asian philosophies. That is, there's this broader assumption about being and knowing in Asian philosophies. And that assumption, that ontological and epistemological assumption in many Asian philosophies, is this idea of relationality, the idea that relationships matter, the idea and practice of seeing all things as interconnected, as mutually constituted, as giving rise to one another. And we see the interconnectedness and mutual constitution of all things, for example, in the Chinese or Taoist yin-yang philosophy. And put simply, the yin-yang philosophy posits that the universe and all phenomena in the universe are produced through the intra and interactions of cosmic energies known as yin, or the black side, and yang, the white side. To give you some examples, with life there is death, with light there is darkness, and so on and so forth. And I'm not talking about yin and yang here as if they're just total opposites, but I'm trying to encourage an understanding, and I think this is what yin yang is telling us too, that all things are relative to one another. So not just total opposites, but relative to one another. And what you'll notice in the symbol that's on screen at the moment is that each side also carries the seed of the other. So there's a black circle in the white side and the white circle in the black side. And this to me further portrays this idea of interconnectedness and mutual constitution of all things. That even if you do break the symbol into half and you've got a white side and a black side, that even they cannot exist in and of themselves, but always through this relationship with the other side that penetrates each side of the symbol. And I think that idea is also evident in the really looseness of yin and yang, sort of against dominant Western traditions that seem to, cement things, that seem to have absolute clarity. Yin and yang resist that kind of thinking. Yin and yang embody the very philosophy that they espouse, and that is what yin and yang constitutes isn't clear from the outset, but is determined in particular context. So again, in one context, yin might be life and yang death. In another context, yin might be light and yang might be darkness, and so on and so forth. And that to me further portrays this idea that nothing can exist in and of itself. Even yin and yang can't exist in and of itself, but they are determined in particular contexts, in particular instances, in relation to otherness, other contexts that are yet to come. And I think also this notion of relationality is evident too in Buddhism, particularly via the notion of Pratit Yasamutpada, which is loosely translated in English as the doctrine of dependent origination. Like yin and yang, Pratit Yasamutpada posits that everything in the universe is dependent on something else. No single being or thing exists independently, but rather all things come into being in relationship and as relationship. I become a brother only through the gift that is my sibling. I am a teacher only through relationships with students who too teach me. Right at this very moment, I'm not a husband, in part because no one's taken that wise advice of Beyonce and put a ring on it. But I hope you get the point that I'm trying to make here, which is that all things don't exist in and of themselves, but always come into being in those relationships. As I mentioned earlier, Te Tiriti is the other that makes my being possible, that makes my being here in Aotearoa possible. In Aotearoa and in the broader Tiriti relationship, I am manuhiri, I am guest in relationship with tangata whenua, my host, the people of this land. I am and become tangata tiriti in relationship with tangata whenua. So it's this idea that there is always an other that makes my being possible. And just as an aside, in my work, the notion of the other keeps coming up. And it keeps coming up for me because all of my work, in a way, is a response to some of the histories that Clive mentioned earlier. And that is in response to the killing fields, in response to the genocide that my father survived. And the other becomes really important for me because I've been trying to think about other ways of being in the world, other ways of seeing our relationships with other people that aren't premised on this execution, literally in the killing fields, literally in the Cambodian context, this execution of the other, this trying to annihilate the other, you know, this sense that we see the other always in pejorative terms, the sense that we see the immigrant as, you know, the unwanted immigrant, the undesirable alien, the sense that we see disabled people as people who have traits that we don't desire, or that we see, you know, our LGBTQ plus relations as people who are pejoratively other. And so for me in my work, I've been trying to think about different ways of seeing the other, different ways of understanding our relationships with the other that are much more productive than seeing the other as pejorative, as seeing the other as this person that we, or these people, or these things that we might annihilate or should annihilate because they are quote unquote undesirable. And so that's for me why I'm so interested in how we think about the other, and why philosophies that articulate more productive ways of being in relationship with the other are so central to my work. And that leads me to the other tenet of my work, and another tenet that I think is very critical for many Asian philosophies. And it's this idea that we have an ethical responsibility for others. It's this orientation of care for the other that I see so much in Asian philosophies. For instance, for those of us who are Cantonese speakers, Sek Jiao Fan Mea, have you eaten yet? Are some of the first words that we, you know, that come out of our mouths upon seeing the other. And this greeting for me demonstrates an immediate orientation or care for the other. To me, it says, I'm interested in you. I'm interested in your nourishment. I'm interested in your well-being. Often, at least in my experiences, it doesn't really matter whether you've eaten already or not. We still go and eat together anyway, or at the very least, we share a pot of tea or whatever we might be consuming. Also instilled in us from a very young age, or some of us from a very young age, is this idea that we never arrive at someone's house empty-handed. And this was an insight that came out in a number of my interviews with my participants who I knew, or who I termed my co-researchers in my PhD study. And it really echoed the experiences that I grew up with. My parents and grandmother, when I was younger, would always remind me never to go next door, never go to the neighbor's house when we were playing video games empty-handed. I always had to take something, whether it was lemons from our tree or a packet of biscuits from our pantry. It didn't really matter what it was really. What mattered was that I showed up with something, and that set this tone of respectful relationships. It demonstrated that I acknowledged my hosts. For many Asian cultures, this notion of the face is also really critical. And just, well, I mean, I don't have time to unpack this in a whole lot of detail, but just very simply, The face is this metaphor for a person's social standing. And the face demands my ethical responsibility. From a young age, we're encouraged to avoid actions or inactions that might lead to anyone losing face, or tearing someone's face, or snapping someone's face, and so on. We're reminded of our responsibility to preserve the face and give face in our face-to-face encounters with others. We're reminded to show our face, to show up. In my own household, I think about, whenever a wedding invitation shows up or a birthday invitation shows up, there's always this checking of our calendars to make sure who's available, and at least one of us must be there to reflect our family, to represent our family. As I wrote in my thesis, showing up demonstrates that I choose to be here, right here beside you at this very moment, at your service, despite the infinite competing demands of our everyday lives and the others for whom I am also responsible. Buddhism similarly encourages us to practice ethical responsibility. And we see this, for example, through the notion of metta, or loving kindness, and karuna, or this notion of compassion towards others. And by love here, I'm not referring to romantic or emotional affection and attachment as everyday understandings of the term love may evoke, but rather metta is the cultivation of this altruistic benevolence, this notion of friendship, this goodwill towards the other, human and non-human. And so in different ways, these very brief Asian philosophies that I'm sharing on screen at the moment articulate and demonstrate this ethic of responsibility for the other, this concern for others. And these are not, in my view, just empty cultural gestures. By that, I mean, these are not just simply well-meaning ideas and words. Asian philosophies, in my view, don't see thinking and practice as separate, but rather as two sides of the same coin. There's not kind of this Cartesian, that is the philosophy of René Descartes. There's not this kind of separation of dualisms, this nature, culture, mind, body, thinking, practice, as if these things are just separate. And this perhaps goes back even before Descartes, and maybe goes all the way to Plato, and who knows if it goes even further. But Asian philosophies, for me, invites the interplay of thinking and practice. How could Buddhism, how could meditation, how could Qingming, how could all of these things be conceived as just ideas devoid of practical application? My view is that they cannot. My view is that thinking and practice are always in relationship, in conjunction in Asian philosophy. And so Asian ethics aren't just these well-meaning ideas. They're actually ideas that also demand action. And for me, Asian ethics can help us to think and act in the tiriti relationship, especially concerning our responsibilities as Asian tangata tiriti. Asian ethics reminds me of our responsibilities to te tiriti and tangata whenua, and crucially remind us that we must do something. Asian ethics privilege the intersubjective relation. That is, they privilege this relationship between you and me. They remind us that good, ethical, personal relationships are the bedrock of sociality. And I think they echo insights from Te Ao Māori, which stresses the importance of personal, positive relationships. Ngāti Hau and Ngāpuhi scholar Te Kauaho Hoskins explains that, and I quote, "The Western paradigm emphasizes law and policy, but our indigenous knowing tells us that good personal relationships are the key to the possibility of anything. Without them, that is, without good personal relationships, and despite having treaty, policy, or legislation, process can grind to a halt or become opposition." But while Asian ethics privilege personal relationships, I don't see them as limited only to the intersubjective relation. I think these Asian ethics can help to guide macro-political work. These Asian ethics can affect the macro-political. That is, they can have an effect on and move us emotionally towards the macro-political. Working for constitutional transformation, for example, can be a tangible manifestation of ensuring that as manuhiri, we don't arrive and meet tangata whenua empty-handed. Working towards constitutional transformation can also be a way of enacting metta, loving kindness, or giving face to our tangata whenua hosts. And I think our relationships and our responsibilities to the other, they run the gamut of everyday lives. I'm not sure that there is ever this clean-cut division between the personal and the political. I think these Asian ethics encompass both the minutiae, both the micro-political, our everyday relations, as well as the macro-political. And of course, as feminists have long reminded us, the personal is political. And just by way of wrapping up, Matua Moana Jackson said, and I quote, "The treaty to me has never been about treaty rights. It's always been about the rightness that comes from people accepting their obligations to each other." And I think the Asian philosophies, which I've touched on all too fleetingly this morning, teach us something about our obligations to each other. These ideas, these practices speak back to the intellectual heritages and the distinct genealogy from which our Asian communities come. These ideas and practices that I've touched on here add Asian voices to utility and indigenous settler relations, where Pākehā experiences and voices and worldviews still dominate settler perspectives as present. These and other Asian ethical ideas and practices, for me, give us vocabulary, our own vocabulary, to mobilize our communities. They're ideas and practices that are not necessarily foreign to our communities. These are ethical ideas and practices that perhaps already inform our everyday lives. And so what I've tried to do and what I've tried to provide here are just some ways that we can speak to our communities about our relationships with tangata whenua, our relationships with te tiriti, and why we should be engaging in tiriti justice. And just in the last sort of 30 seconds to a minute, our focus here has been around looking back by looking forward, which is a particular way of understanding time, as I've mentioned, that's central to many Asian philosophies. And so for me, looking back by looking forward has been a way of, I guess, reaching for the wisdom, the meditations of our ancestors, to see how they might help to inform relationships with tangata whenua and te tiriti in the present and in the future. And so I'll hand now back to Saburo, who will say a few words about how this concluding thought relates to his work.
Tēnā koe, Lincoln. Ngui te mihi, kia koe moto kōrero. I just want to make a really quick point. I know there's one question for you too, maybe. Acknowledging your earlier points on Asian philosophy isn't the real thing. And in terms of my earlier research, a lot of people spoke to me about their experiences, second and third generation onwards, migrants, Asian in Aotearoa, told me that being Asian isn't a cool thing. And that had a lot of impact on them kind of withdrawing from, maintaining the language and culture. And there were also people who chose not to do that because of the constant assimilated pressure. So there's a huge institutional racism, still existing in this country. In terms of the kiwaha that you just quoted, Japanese often say that as well, even these days. We need to know what's good for us. We need to know what makes us as a person today. Don't shape our own identity against other people. we start making offering to other people, we need to, have our own dignity to respect other people, especially on tangata whenua. Anyway, so that's just my quick concluding thoughts, and I just mute myself.
Like, kia ora korua, ngā mihi nui kia korua. Thank you so much, both of you. That we've heard some inspirational thoughts, ideas, insights this morning, and there's been some tremendous interaction and feedback from people in the chat. I really like the way in which we've seen all these hearts floating up during the course of your talk, and that's an indication of tremendous positivity among our audience. We've got time now for some questions. There they go. Lovely to see hearts floating around this talk. It really, really helps to remind us of the importance of the messages that we're hearing this morning. So we've got some questions in the chat, and I'm going to go to the first one, which is from a man by the name of Graham Storer. Now, Graham used to live in Cambodia, so I'm sure he was very impressed by the comments that you had to make, Lincoln. In fact, he's got a question here specifically for you. The question is, your work speaks clearly to how Asian philosophies resonate to values that underpin Te Tiriti. Are there similar resonances for new migrants from other locations, and what might Pākehā learn from these? Over to you, Lincoln. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Thanks, Clive, and thanks, Graham. Nice to be reconnected with you through this particular forum. Yeah, some big questions there. I mean, my PhD study was small in the sense that I only spoke to 3 people, but just through wider conversations outside of the PhD, I think there are certainly resonances for what you've called other new migrants. And I've been having some of these conversations with other migrants or immigrants from outside of Asia too, and there are certainly points of connection, parallels there that they've noticed in terms of relationality, but also in terms of this primordial kind of orientation of ethical responsibility for the other. So I certainly see that in other contexts, and that might be a provocation for others to write up that study. What might Pākehā learn from this? I mean, I think there's a lot there. I think there's. I think we act and think in certain ways, and Pākehā, like Asians, like others, have inherited a form of thinking from others before them. And I think my provocation to Pākehā is not to say that we necessarily have to be the same, not necessarily to say that you have to think the same way that I do, you have to adopt relationality and all of that sort of stuff. But I think at the very least to recognize that there are other ways of being in the world, other ways of thinking that are much more relational. And I think these other relational ways of being offer us something in this work that we're engaged in. Because often I think in justice work, we tend to take an oppositional approach to the political. And I'm not rejecting that particular approach, but I just want people to be cautious that politics of opposition for me is a tool of colonialism. And if we are to take Audre Lorde's provocation seriously, and her provocation is that the master's tools will never deconstruct the master's house, or words to that effect, what are some of the other tools that we might make use of? How might we take an indigenizing approach that, as Te Kauhau mentions, centers relationality? How might that help us to think about and engage in the political differently than we are currently, where we tend to, generally speaking, just make use of the oppositional approach? And again, I'm not dismissing, I'm not rejecting the oppositional approach. I think there are moments for all of these approaches what I'm just trying to think about is how might engaging in an oppositional politics approach only take us so far, and how might other ways of being, other forms of engaging in the political, what might they offer? How might they help us to deconstruct the master's house without using
And I think
the
we're going to
master's
finish on that
tools?
note, Lincoln. Those are really, really useful and wise questions. And I'll just draw people's attention to the fact that we have come to the end of our hour. It's been a very enriching time, and there have been some tremendous thoughts and insights shared during the course of this really important seminar. I'll just draw your attention to the chat. The moderator has pointed out that you can continue the conversation by going to some of these sites that you can read in the chat. And I just want to also point out that we have had a significant increase in the number of partners who have supported this really important initiative throughout the week. I believe we have now gone from 35 to 40 partners who have shown tremendous support for this initiative. So I'd like to personally thank them on behalf of the organisers of these really important Tiriti-based futures seminars. So just let me wind up with that karakia. But before I do that, I just want to thank both Lincoln and Saburo for your tremendous contribution to this really important seminar series. Thank you so much. And thank you to all the people in the audience who have been participating throughout the seminar. Thank you so much. Nō reira, tēnā tātou nau mai ki te karakia whakamutanga. Unahia ki te uru tapu nui. Kia wātia, kia mama, tanākau te tinana, te wairua ara tangata. Koira e rongo, whakaurea ake ki ronga, kia tina, hui e, ai ki e. Kia ora mai tātou.
Tēnā koutou katoa.